This is Seymour Rocks reporting from down under. Um, so I'm just putting something together. Uh, I want to try and kind of explain how I feel about it, my thoughts. I've been trying um, in my reports to be objective as possible. I haven't tried to project an outcome, and you'll notice that I hardly mention the word blue sea event in my reports. And of course, I suppose sometimes a little bit of emotion seeps through, but mostly I've tried to keep it kind of objective. So I just want to change that because I think that yesterday's news, or the news of the last couple of days, was so momentous that I just have to kind of sort my head, my heart out, and I'm going to try and do it and share it with you. So, but first of all, I just want to go through a few things. This is more the media kind of response to this, to the extent that there has been any. So I'm just going to share a screen. Okay, so this is one of the pictures from from the Mosaic expedition. So I just want to wait a minute. So my head's not working very well this morning. So anyway, that shows kind of what I've been talking about for months and years. Margot and I have been talking about the deteriorating quality of the ice, but in the official kind of stuff from the experts, there's very little reflection of that. So let's just have a look at how the media has dealt with this. So this was interesting, I thought, this, because I looked up, I thought, oh, what does the Washington Post say about this? Because the Washington Post often has some quite good articles. They're written by staff reporters and they're in depth. But of this, there was nothing except that they reprinted this article from Associated Press. And the headline is, "Scientists on Arctic mission make unplanned detour to pole." So at least they show the photograph. But anyway, here we are. A German icebreaker carrying scientists on a year-long international expedition in the high Arctic has reached the North Pole after making an unplanned detour there due to lighter than usual sea ice conditions. So we made fast progress in a few days. It's breathtaking at times. We had open water as far as the eye could see. Yeah, the region above northern Greenland, sorry, I can't read that because it's behind something else. Anyway, it's usually covered in thicker sea ice, sometimes built over several years, that makes it difficult even for ships with hardened hulls to break through. But the Polish Stern was able to make it from the ice edge of the Fram Strait to the pole in less than a week. The mushy ice conditions the polar stern encountered this year provide further evidence of the warming scientists say is taking place at the Arctic. And then they just go on saying it involves scientists from 17 countries. It sailed from the Norwegian port of Tromsø last September, anchored to an ice floe, conducted numerous experiments, blah, blah, blah. The coronavirus almost caused the mission to be cut short as travel restrictions made resupply and crew rotations difficult, but they found a way around the logistical hurdles that involved just a brief break from the ice. After passing the pole, the Polish Stern will anchor to a newly formed floe and observe the start of the freezing process that will see the Arctic covered once more in a mantle of sea ice. So you can see it's just a human interest story. They're implying that the whole thing is going to freeze. They ignore the reality that this is part of a continual decline in the quality of ice. And but this was more on because this is from the Barents Observer, and I would expect this. Expedition shows scary photos from the North Pole, loose and weak ice with lots of melt ponds, partially open water, and no signs of multi-year ice. The powerful photograph from Mosaic expedition reaching the North Pole on August the 19th showed the dramatic impact of climate changes. So there we are. A little bit of truth. It's probably about the only thing. But it was this. I was really surprised to see this from Channel 9 in Australia. And they say climate change. Historic Arctic heat wave has thawed the North Pole so much it has shattered. So in other words, it's just we've had really hot weather and that has melted the ice and you know, end of story. So it's just a one-off thing. Next year might be cooler, so we'll have more ice, blah, blah, blah. I just wanted to share this lightning in North Greenland, south of Tula, yesterday. Now that is pretty amazing. I don't think that that has happened in the past. So anyway, so now I'm just going to show you a report that shows a scientific paper that shows the actual reality, and of course it's going to be ignored by everybody. I've just had this come across my bow, this article. It's the first bit of truth. This is what I've been saying for years. So anyway, let's just have a look. So this is from August 21, 2020. Arctic Ocean moorings shed light on winter sea ice loss. The eastern Arctic Ocean's winter ice grew less than half as much as normal during the past decade due to the increasing influence of heat from the ocean's interior, researchers have found. The finding came from an international study led by the University of Alaska Fairbanks and Finnish Meteorological Institute. The study, published by the Journal of Climate, used data collected by ocean moorings in the Eurasian basin of the Arctic Ocean from 2003 to 2018. So the moorings measured the heat released from the ocean interior to the upper ocean and sea ice during winter. In 2016 to 2018, the estimated heat flux was about 10 watts per square meter, which is enough to prevent 80 to 90 centimeters, almost 3 feet of sea ice from forming each year. Previous heat flux measurements were about half that much. So typically across much of the Arctic, a thick layer of cold, fresher water known as halocene isolates the heat associated with the intruding Atlantic water from the sea surface and from the sea ice. This new study shows that the abnormal influx of salty warm water from the Atlantic Ocean is weakening and thinning the halocene, allowing more mixing. According to this new study, warm water of the Atlantic Ocean is now moving much closer to the surface, etc., etc. Well, touche. That's what I've been saying all along. A lot of what I've been saying over the years has been railing against official denial the inability of the media to speak the truth, the inability of some scientists to speak the truth. And this was true. I mean, if you go back over my blog, it's full of that. And of course, I went through a period of extreme anger over this, and partially influenced by my my involvement in what I would now probably describe as a cult. But I just want to tell one story to illustrate it. This official kind of denial. A few years ago, I went to a meeting in our public library that was held by a retired professor from Victoria University. It's probably just as well that I can't remember his name. Anyway, he presented a film that he had made 10 years earlier, and I found myself nodding my head with agreement. It was absolutely accurate and a very good film. And then when the film finished, he started speaking, and everything he had to say was a denial of what he'd been saying 10 years earlier. He was giving all the reasons why there was lots and lots of hope. Things weren't as bad as kind of was thought, and you know, the media was responsible for feeding kind of negativity. And then there was a lot of talk about planting trees and stuff like that. And then when I raised a question, and I just made an observation of just kind of what I was seeing. I wasn't trying to lecture or anything. And he became very, very angry, and you know, kind of denied it. And that's when he was saying his most kind of extreme comments. And then a wee while later, I heard from some friends who had bumped into him, and he admitted to them privately that he didn't know how he would deal with a world without glaciers, because he's a glaciologist, by the way. So he was saying one thing in private and exactly the opposite in public, and that kind of, you know, I'm not sure what the motivation is, whether it's denial or just not wanting to kind of scare the punters, or what it is. And I just find that I mean, even today, I'll just share this. This is from Zach Labe, who is absolutely, I mean, you know, almost without peer in describing, you know, in researching this. But this thing, you know, even 2 days after these reports from the Polish dam that show that the the ice, you know, at the North Pole, at 90 degrees north, you know, all we've got is this thin kind of ice that's just not really hardly ice at all. And he's and then he's posting this, you know, he's going on just, you know, about the sea ice extent is currently the second lowest on record. I mean, hell's bells. Why not give some, you know, some context to this? The situation, you know, well, you know, it's really bad, but it's not as bad as we, you know, as it could be, unless you take into account, of course, the the ice at the North Pole. And then I saw something else. I couldn't find it again, and it went around the different parts of the Arctic and to show that, you know, there was kind of almost record thickness of ice and or something, you know, in the little inlets of the Canadian archipelago or something like that. So, I mean, that, I don't know what that was about. Was that trying to tell us that, you know, it's really not so serious because there are these areas of of ice that are actually 2 meters thick, where a few years ago they might have been 4 meters thick. So that sort of thing. Anyway, so I regard that as a highly, yeah, as a form of denial. And of course, I've never liked it, and I don't like it. But now I'm able just to mention it. I don't get sort of angry or obsessed by it. So anyway, there's that. This came across my bow yesterday, I think, or the day before. On the very day, or the day after the photographs came out of the Arctic, which just show how incredibly bad things are. And he's, despite all of that, and knowing that, he posts this, projecting sea ice extent from August 21st. Using losses from the previous 20 years, none produce a minimum below 2012. The average melt rate would place 2020 at the second lowest, while the slowest melt would result in fifth lowest. 1920 produced the second lowest minimum on record. Oh God, spare me. You know, I mean, this is, so I went back, I said, do you people ever adapt your narrative to reality? Days after mosaic show thin, slushy, disappearing ice right at the North Pole. I suppose you can point to 2 meter thick ice north of the Canadian archipelago to say that this is the second worst year, which it clearly is not. And of course, as usual, they never ever address the points you're making. I said, in my mind, after the reports from Mosaic, this verges on being disinformation. So he comes back. I've never denied what the photographs of the polar stern said. In fact, I've used it in recent tweets to highlight how vulnerable the ice around 80 degrees north is to the current weather conditions. If you read more than one or two of my tweets before your conspiratorial rants, you would know this too. Well, I don't know kind of where the conspiracy comes in. I was just pointing out, you know, stuff that he should know. So he doesn't refer to the ice melting from beneath. It's all just the weather conditions, and he doesn't make any connection to the sea ice thickness, or he doesn't connect that to the yeah, he doesn't connect it with sea ice thickness with sea ice extent. So okay. And then he comes back overnight. These particular posts are about the extent metric. I also have posts about volume satellite imagery of ice and other analysis. I agree we're in an unprecedented situation, but having consistent time series derived from observable and measurable metrics is still useful. Well, I call that bloody weasel words myself. And then it gets more and more kind of emotive. See, cherry picking bits of information is something you have no experience in. Then concocting grand conspiracies is anti-science. If, like I said, you looked at more than one tweet for context, then you'd realize how foolish you're being. Well, I have looked at his other tweets, and I'm not being foolish, and I'm not laying out a grand conspiracy either, and I'm not anti-science. I'm only anti-science when the scientific data is used to posit something that's been proven right at every point. You know, the modelers were saying, you know, that things were going to get bad in 2100. You know, their models told them that, and now they've had to, reality has forced them to redo the data, and now they've come up with 2050. And of course, you know, despite the Arctic melting in front of our very eyes, then they still say, oh, it's going to melt in 2040. So, yeah. I have a strange relationship with climate change deniers. In a strange way, I don't mind them too much, so long as they don't mind me. And it perplexes me how they can see some things so clearly, but be so obstinate over climate change. I guess it comes down to what you want to believe. And with them, often it comes down to what they identify as, well, complete corruption, the New World Order in governments and international organisations like the IPCC. And it just about always comes down to Agenda 21 or Agenda 2030. Often what they come up with is true in part, except they all, to a man, cannot distinguish between the corruption of elites from what is actually happening in nature. Now that we have crossed various trigger points and unleashed a huge number of positive feedbacks, I think the debate about CO2 and greenhouse gases and their contribution to warming has become almost irrelevant. CO2 is now entering the atmosphere at a huge rate, and that's coming from natural sources like massive wildfires more than it's coming from man-made industrial sources. Gaia has a mind of her own. At this juncture, it does not matter to me whether warming is coming from CO2, whether it's coming from underneath the earth, or even from terraforming of the earth by aliens. In some ways, it does not matter what people believe anymore. Although I believe solidly that climate change is largely due to greenhouse effect and CO2 and other emissions. We are living well and truly in the era of consequences, whatever we do. The deniers do have a point. My partner looked at Agenda 2030 the other day, and she is an ex-civil servant and quite familiar with the language. Looking at it, it is full of aspirational goals that seem quite positive until you look behind the weasel words and realise that we're moving further and further from fulfilling the lofty goals that they put forward, and until you realise that the only main area where they're advancing right now is in their plans to vaccinate the entire population of the planet. And that's set out in considerable detail by the World Health Organization as part of Agenda 2030. So on balance, I don't really mind the deniers to some extent, and I certainly don't want to criminalise them or cancel them like the Liberals want to do, who just want to wipe out anything that opposes their viewpoint from the record. So what I want to say to these people is, I don't care what you think or what your opinion is, and Mother Nature certainly doesn't care. Mother Nature is indifferent to what humans think. The polar ice is not going to stop thawing simply because you think it is not. Yeah, I find myself kind of in a very tiny minority within another tiny minority, and that, of course, the tiny minority that I'm talking about is the near-term human extinction kind of movement, and kind of, yeah, Guy McPherson is the one that's been responsible for that. I've always accepted his ideas, but based on the evidence that he provides, but I've never been, kind of fully on board I've defended him many times, you know, when he was attacked by sort of official deniers, and I would stand by that to this very day. But something that I've been able to understand less and less over the last couple of years is this obsession. Well, obsession with the Blue Sea event, and of course it's coming. But you know, the question was always kind of, you know, when is it going to be? This year? Is it going to be next year? And I've learned a few things in the last couple of years. In 2018, I got to know Margot, and somehow we managed to start sharing things. And she shared with me a lot of the stuff that she was doing to monitor the sea ice, which she shared with me, and which she'd worked out on herself. Nobody had told her. And of course, it's highly accurate. And what we realized is that it's not the Blue Sea event, but it's what's happening now. You know, the constant whittling away of the ice from beneath through the the warm currents from the Atlantic and everything, and we were just showing this. You know, it was really bad in 2018, and it was a bit worse in 2019, and of course this year, well, we've just seen what we have. So I think 2018 was the last year in which Guy might have made a prognosis. He said, you know, oh, there's going to be a Blue Sea event. And from what I remember, and this really upset me greatly, was at the end of it, of course, as with last year, at the very last minute, you know, we were saved for another year because Blue Sea event didn't happen. And then I remember some people threw a multi-year party to celebrate this non-event, and it was just crazy. There was nothing to celebrate. Yeah, the constant sort of decline, you know, of the sea ice, as if there's a singular event. Everything's all right until the Blue Sea event happens. And I've never really, you know, quite understood that. And even now, you know, I see someone on Twitter who is, you know, saying, "Oh, it's a bad melt day. You know, there's a 20% chance of a blue ocean event," or yesterday there was a 23% chance, and today it's a 30% chance. That seems just totally meaningless. I mean, for a start, I just don't really get where he gets his figures from, and that all seems to be based around analysing sea ice extent and ignoring the other important aspects. I mean, otherwise, how could you calculate that that's the case? So yeah, I don't think there's going to be a sea ice Blue Sea event in the classic meaning of the word. There's still a reasonable area of ice, kind of in, you know, in the inlets of the Canadian archipelago, and then north of that, there's ice that's 2 meters thick, whereas in previous years it was perhaps 4 meters thick. You know, old ice. So yeah, I just don't really understand this, and it seems to me like, with all denial, there's a lot of deflection. There's a lot of trying to justify things, and it's either or. But of course, in reality, it's neither either or. It'll be very interesting now that we know that the ice has practically melted at the North Pole, and for most of the region between the Greenland and the North Pole. What's going to happen in the next few months? How is that going to affect the the refreezing? Because there'll be larger areas of dark sea. There'll be less, even more, less albedo, and what's that going to do with the methane and everything? So, we don't need this singular event to trigger these things. It's an ongoing process, and we're not at the end. And even if we see a blue sea event, that's not the end either. I might not be expressing this very clearly, but that's kind of how I feel about things. So, how do I feel about all of this? There's hardly a day that goes by that I do not grieve for the world around me, for the living planet, and for all the wondrous creatures that inhabit it, as well as for the people. And right now, as I speak this, I feel a constant anxiety that manifests as a feeling of heaviness in the chest. I didn't feel it for a lot of the day, but when I started listening to a video about all of this, it just immediately came back. So how can one not feel this if one stops for a single moment to reflect on the dying polar bears, the effect on indigenous people in the Arctic, and what comes next, the crop failures that will come even without the vaunted blue sea event? We're just living in the age of consequences, and you can see it in the pictures from the North Pole. It's not as if that is the only predicament that the human race is facing. From war to economic collapse to a worldwide pandemic that seems to me to have been predicted and engineered to create a move from a relatively open society to an authoritarian society where the populations are hungry and have no human rights anymore and are basically completely under the control of a global elite that nobody ever voted for. So right now I can't see any grounds for real hope that we're ever going to come out the other side of this and maintain any sort of civilization, even if we survive this at all. So the question of are we facing near-term human extinction or are we not is also, well, it's moot. And in fact, when I stop to think about this, I think there's a fate that's worse than death. And that's that humans continue to exist in some form of half-human, half-artificial intelligence, essentially as hungry ghosts that live some form of half-life. Now that is my true nightmare. I'd rather die than be a slave. And so I feel this very, very, very deeply and increasingly as time goes on, and especially in the last couple of days. So there are various aspects to this. that determine how I deal with this. Firstly, there's my own health, which has been on a slide for 10 years now, without any diagnosis or health intervention that has ever helped me, and it appears to have a large neurological component. Every day I wake up from a night of assisted sleep and have to deal with dizziness, and I get around these days with the help of a walking stick. I keep working despite the odds, and at best these days I have a few hours when I have the clarity of mind and the energy to continue my work. That usually turns to custard by mid-afternoon. I've had plenty of opportunity to contemplate my own demise and come to accept it. In addition, for 30 years I've had a spiritual practice that was largely based on Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, and I'm a great fan of Krishnamurti. I've never really believed in God in the sense of an old man with a beard in the sky. However, I have imbibed the idea that I'm not this body or even my mind, but rather all that there is and ever has been is consciousness, or whatever label you like to give it, totality or God or Jehovah. In the words of David Icke, he expresses it quite well, I'm consciousness having this experience as Robin, and when I leave this body I will return to undifferentiated consciousness. So for me there's no real reason for fear of death, and I think that fear of death is behind all the reactions of anger and denial and whatever. I don't really, well, I like to think anyway, that I don't have anything more than an animal fear of death, which is common to all sentient beings. It does not educate the way in which I see the world as it does for most people who to react to this whole predicament from a fear of death. But on the other hand, I'll come clean and admit that apart from my beloved partner, I have no one else other than friends. I have no living parents, I don't have children, I don't have grandchildren, so there's no one really for me to kind of worry about. So I guess that's part of the picture as well. But I am empathic, and I feel everything deeply, and I feel the fate of others. But what is largely missing in this equation is fear. So I endeavour to stay with the what is and the present moment, and do not dwell too much on what may come next, although I do study it, so intellectually. And obviously, as I've pointed out, I feel it viscerally. So I try generally to keep the I out of what I do. So I'm not trying in what I do, keeping a blog going for year after year to attract either fame or notoriety, but I've always expressed my role as being akin to a postman. So I see some information, I send it there. I see some information there, and I send it over there. And yeah, so I'm not looking for likes or dislikes, even though it does aggrieve me when I observe, of course, that people are not seeing clearly, but are falling into kind of instinctual behaviour, of anger and denial, and arguing or trying to deflect or anything like that. I think it behoves us to stop all of that in its tracks and just to look at the facts as they are or as we see them, and also just to be with our own response, visceral or emotional, just to kind of see it as that's what the body does. So that in brief is kind of to give you an idea of my own kind of subjective experience of all of this. So yeah.